The young pilot stood in line at the check-in counter, his eyes scanning the bustling airport terminal. It was just another day, or so he thought. He had worked hard to get where he was, a successful pilot with years of experience under his belt. Today's flight was a routine one, and he was looking forward to the quiet moments of reflection he often found mid-air. He had a ticket to sit in business class, just like any senior officer or high-ranking passenger, a small luxury he had earned after so many long hours in the cockpit. However, something felt off when he approached the gate. As he showed his ticket to the airline staff, he noticed the slight hesitation in the attendant's eyes. She took a moment to look at him, almost as if she were uncertain. She scanned the ticket once more, her fingers hovering over the computer screen. The pilot, accustomed to this process, waited calmly, but he couldn't shake the odd feeling that something was amiss. Finally, the attendant glanced up and smiled, though there was an unmistakable awkwardness in her expression. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but firm, "I'm afraid we don't have any available seats in business class right now. You'll need to take a seat in economy." The pilot blinked, surprised. He had a business class ticket. He had confirmed it multiple times when booking the flight. He felt a bit of frustration bubble up inside him. "I believe there's a mistake. I'm supposed to be in business class," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The attendant looked at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out what to do. "I'm sorry, sir. The system shows that there's no seat for you in business class. Economy is the only option available at the moment. You'll need to sit there." He felt a rush of confusion. How could this happen? He had checked everything. His uniform, his flight details, everything was in order. Yet here he was, being told to sit in economy, with no clear explanation. He glanced at the small crowd forming behind him, noticing a few curious glances directed his way. Was this some kind of mistake or something else? With a deep sigh, he asked, "Can you double-check the system, please? I'm a pilot for the airline." The attendant hesitated before nodding and glancing at the computer screen again. A few more tense seconds passed before she looked back at him. "I'm afraid there's nothing I can do," she said, her tone colder than before. "Please proceed to the economy section." At that moment, the pilot could feel the sting of discomfort creeping in. He was being treated like any other passenger, like someone who didn't belong in the more exclusive spaces of the plane. His uniform, his position, none of that seemed to matter. As if sensing his frustration, the attendant offered a smile, but it did little to ease the tension. With a slow nod, he turned and began to make his way toward the economy section, the sound of his footsteps mingling with the murmur of the crowd behind him. He could feel eyes on him as he moved through the aisle. People looked at him with curious glances, and he couldn't help but wonder if they were thinking the same thing. Why was a pilot, someone who should have been in business class, sitting in economy? The captain of a flight should be seated with the other high-ranking crew members, not with the regular passengers. His mind started racing, but he couldn't quite figure out why this was happening. It felt like more than just a simple mistake. It felt like an assumption. As he found his seat in economy, he noticed the space was cramped, the seats smaller than what he was used to in business class. A sense of frustration built up within him as he settled into the seat, adjusting his uniform and trying to focus on the flight ahead. But no matter how hard he tried, his mind kept returning to the nagging question: why had he been treated this way? Why had the airline staff assumed he didn't belong in business class? He had worked so hard to get where he was in life. From a young age, he had dreamed of becoming a pilot, of soaring through the skies, and of proving to the world that anyone, no matter their background, could achieve greatness. It had taken years of hard work and determination to earn his position as a pilot. He had climbed through the ranks, faced countless challenges, and proved himself over and over again. Yet in this moment, it felt like all of that hard work had been reduced to nothing. All the achievements, the training, the countless hours in the cockpit, it all seemed irrelevant in the eyes of the airline staff. As the plane taxied down the runway, his mind remained heavy with thoughts of the encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play here. Was it simply a mistake? Or was it something more? The pilot glanced out of the window, watching as the city skyline disappeared beneath a sea of clouds. It was supposed to be a simple flight, a routine trip to another destination. But now it had become a moment of introspection. Just as the plane ascended into the sky, the pilot leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. He knew he would have to face whatever came next with resilience, but in that moment, he couldn't shake the thought. How could something so simple, like a seat on an airplane, have such an impact on how he was seen? And was this just the beginning of a much larger journey? A journey into the heart of who he was, and how the world saw him. As the pilot settled into his seat in economy, a sense of discomfort washed over him. He adjusted his uniform for what seemed like the 100th time, trying to make himself feel more at ease in the cramped space. The hum of the plane and the chatter of passengers around him did little to distract from the questions swirling in his mind. He was used to the smooth, controlled environment of the cockpit, where everything had a purpose, a plan. But here, sitting among the regular passengers, he couldn't shake the sense of being out of place. He looked around, his eyes scanning the rows of passengers. The faces around him were all familiar in their own way, but none of them stood out. They were just everyday people. None of them could have known the level of responsibility that lay on his shoulders when he was in the cockpit, guiding a plane through the skies. It struck him, in that moment, how easily the world made assumptions about who people were based on appearances or titles. He wasn't just any passenger. He was a pilot, someone who had worked hard to earn his place. Yet here he was, treated as if he didn't belong. As he stared out of the small window beside him, watching the world shrink beneath the wings of the plane, a mix of frustration and confusion filled his thoughts. What had just happened? Why was he being told to sit in economy when he had a business class ticket? It didn't make sense. Surely, someone would have checked his status before telling him where to sit. But no, it was like his entire identity as a pilot had been overlooked in favor of some other assumption. The pilot tried to shake the thoughts from his mind. It wasn't worth dwelling on. He had a job to do, and no matter where he sat on the plane, that job wouldn't change. But even as the plane climbed higher into the sky, the feeling of being misjudged lingered. He had spent years training, learning, and proving himself in a world that often didn't expect much from someone like him. But today, for some reason, all of that felt irrelevant. It felt like the world had reduced him to nothing more than another passenger, nothing more than the seat he occupied. As the plane continued its ascent, he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was still trying to make sense of it all when a flight attendant passed by, noticing his gaze fixed on the window. She smiled politely, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he had achieved or how much responsibility he carried. She didn't know that he had dedicated his life to becoming a pilot, that he had worked through long hours, early mornings, and stressful days just to get to this point. She didn't know any of that. To her, he was just another person in a seat, just another passenger. She leaned down and asked if he needed anything, but the pilot simply shook his head, offering a small smile in return. There was no point in explaining himself, no point in trying to make her understand. He had been treated this way before, and he knew that sometimes, no matter what you did, people would make assumptions about you. They would judge you based on appearances, based on what they thought they knew about you. And no matter how hard you tried to prove them wrong, it wasn't always enough. The attendant walked away, leaving the pilot to his thoughts. The plane hummed steadily, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft whir of the engines. But in the quiet, the pilot found himself thinking about his past, about the years he had spent studying, working, and proving his worth. His dream of becoming a pilot hadn't been an easy one, and he had faced his fair share of challenges along the way. But every obstacle he had overcome had only made him more determined. He had learned to keep going, to keep pushing forward, no matter how difficult things got. But now, sitting here in economy, something felt different. The world outside the plane's window was vast and full of possibilities, but inside, he felt confined. The seat was too small, the space too cramped, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he didn't belong. It wasn't just about the seat, or the ticket, or the flight. It was about how others saw him, how people could look at him and assume things based on nothing more than a glance. He wasn't just a pilot in a uniform. He was someone who had fought to get where he was, who had worked tirelessly to prove himself, and yet in this moment it didn't seem to matter. As the plane continued its journey, the pilot tried to push those thoughts aside. There were things he could control: his flight, his performance in the cockpit, his career. But there were also things beyond his control, like how others saw him. He couldn't change their perceptions, no matter how much he wished he could. So he focused on the task at hand. The flight would eventually end, and he would go back to doing what he loved: flying. But as the hours passed, and the sky stretched out before him, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if things were different. If people saw him not just as a pilot, but as someone who had earned every step of the journey. If, for once, they could look beyond the surface and see the person beneath. He couldn't change the way things were now, but he could always keep pushing forward. And maybe, just maybe, someday, the world would see him for who he truly was. The young pilot sat back in his seat, still feeling the weight of the misunderstanding lingering in the air. He gazed out of the small window, watching the clouds swirl by below, but his mind wasn't on the beautiful view. He kept thinking about the events that had just unfolded, the way the airline staff had treated him, the way he had been made to feel like just another passenger. It wasn't like him to dwell on things like this, but today was different. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. As the plane soared higher, the pilot tried to push the discomfort aside. He wanted to relax, to enjoy the flight like any other passenger, but it was hard to let go of the feeling of being judged. The thoughts kept circling in his mind. Why had he been treated that way? It wasn't just about the seat in economy. It was about how his worth had been overlooked simply because of how he appeared. Was this how the world saw him all the time? He couldn't help but wonder how much of the world's bias he had faced throughout his life, and how much of it had shaped the way he saw himself. Just as his thoughts were spiraling, he noticed a figure near the front of the plane, watching the passengers with keen interest. The person's presence was different from the others. There was something commanding about them, something that made people stop and take notice. The pilot couldn't help but be curious. Who was this person? Why were they watching everyone so closely? The figure was tall, wearing a crisp suit, and their gaze was focused on him. The pilot felt an odd sensation, as though he was being studied. It wasn't unusual for someone to observe a plane's passengers, especially if they were part of the airline's management. But this felt different. The pilot's instincts kicked in. He was no stranger to the way powerful people carried themselves. There was something about the way this person was watching him that felt intentional. As the plane continued on its journey, the pilot's curiosity only grew. Who was this person, and why had they been paying such close attention to him? He had a feeling that their interest wasn't random, but he couldn't figure out why. It wasn't like he was doing anything special. He was just sitting in a seat in economy class, trying to make sense of the events that had unfolded earlier. Yet, somehow, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Eventually, the figure moved, walking towards the middle of the plane where the pilot was seated. As they drew closer, the pilot's heart rate quickened. There was a sense of anticipation, like something important was about to be revealed. The figure stopped right in front of him, looking down with a calm, measured expression. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The pilot wasn't sure if he should say something, or if he should just wait for the other person to break the silence. And then the figure spoke. "Are you comfortable, Captain?" The voice was smooth and confident, with a hint of authority. The pilot blinked, surprised by the familiarity of the title. He hadn't said a word about his profession to anyone on the plane. So how did this person know? Before he could respond, the figure continued. I noticed the confusion earlier. I wanted to make sure you're all right. A moment of realization hit the pilot like a wave. This person wasn't just any airline employee. They were someone important. But it wasn't just their position that caught his attention. There was something about the way they spoke, something about their confidence, that made him wonder if they knew exactly who he was. The pilot felt a mixture of surprise and curiosity as he looked up at them. I'm fine, he replied, though his voice sounded more uncertain than he intended, just a little confused about the seating situation. The person nodded as if they understood, their gaze softening. I believe there's been a misunderstanding, they said, their words carrying a weight of authority that suggested they had the power to make things right. I'm the owner of this airline, and I've been watching the situation unfold from the moment you boarded. The pilot's mind raced. The owner of the airline. He hadn't expected that. How could this person have been observing him without him even knowing? He felt a sudden rush of surprise, then embarrassment. He hadn't realized someone with such power was watching him. But more than that, he felt a strange sense of relief. If the owner of the airline had been observing the situation, maybe this could be resolved quickly. The owner's gaze softened as they saw the pilot's reaction. I'm sorry for the confusion earlier, they said. It was never my intention for you to be treated like this. I should have intervened sooner. The pilot felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. The owner, the very person responsible for the airline, had been watching him, and now they were apologizing for what had happened. It wasn't something he had expected, but at the same time, it was comforting to know that someone in charge was taking notice of the situation. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, the pilot said quietly, not quite sure how to respond. It wasn't easy to accept an apology, especially from someone who had the power to change everything in an instant. I didn't expect to be treated this way. The owner nodded, their expression thoughtful. I understand, and I want to assure you that this will never happen again. No one should be made to feel lesser, especially not someone who works as hard as you do. Their voice held a note of sincerity that caught the pilot off guard. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement of something deeper, something that had gone unnoticed for far too long. The pilot sat in silence for a moment, processing what had just happened. He couldn't deny that the situation had been unsettling, but now, with the owner's words, he felt a small sense of validation. It wasn't about the seat or the misunderstanding. It was about being recognized for who he was, for the work he had put into his career. It was about being seen, not just as a passenger, but as someone who had earned their place. As the pilot sat in his seat, trying to process everything that had just happened, he couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. The owner of the airline, someone so powerful, had come to speak to him personally. He had expected some kind of formal apology, but the owner's words were different. They were sincere, genuine, and for the first time in a long while, the pilot felt like someone truly understood the frustration he had been carrying. The plane hummed steadily, cutting through the clouds as it soared toward its destination. The owner stood there, watching him closely, waiting for the pilot to respond. For a brief moment, there was silence between them, uncomfortable yet full of unspoken meaning. The pilot wasn't sure what to say. He had spent so much of his life navigating the world of aviation, learning how to read instruments, chart courses, and make split-second decisions, but this situation was different. This wasn't a matter of flying a plane or making a decision in the cockpit. It was about something far deeper, his identity and the way the world saw him. Finally, the pilot broke the silence. I appreciate what you're saying. It means a lot, he said, his voice steady, but filled with a sense of vulnerability he hadn't expected. He had spent so many years proving himself, learning to fly, earning his position, and doing everything by the book. But in this moment, it felt like all those achievements didn't matter. What mattered now was this acknowledgement from the owner, who seemed to see beyond the uniform and the ticket, beyond the role he played in the airline. The owner smiled softly, their eyes meeting the pilot's. "It's not enough to just see you as a pilot. You're more than that," they said, their voice thoughtful. "You've worked hard to get to where you are, and you should be treated with the respect that comes with that." The words struck a chord in the pilot's heart. He had spent so many years feeling like he had to prove himself to everyone around him, always pushing harder, doing more, and never quite feeling like it was enough. But now, here was someone who was acknowledging not just his title as a pilot, but the person he was beneath it. It was a feeling he hadn't realized he needed, but now that he had it, it felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "You're right," the pilot replied, feeling a warmth in his chest. "Sometimes it feels like I'm not seen for all the things I've done. It's like the world sees me and only sees a uniform, not the person who wears it." His voice trailed off for a moment as he collected his thoughts. "It's hard, harder than most people realize." The owner's expression softened even further. "I understand. And I want to make sure something like this never happens again. It was wrong, and I will make sure to personally address it. I don't want anyone who works with this airline to feel like they are less than anyone else." The pilot felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had never expected this kind of response, and yet here it was, coming from the very person who had the power to make real change. It wasn't just an empty promise. It felt like a commitment, something real. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. "Thank you," the pilot said quietly, the words full of gratitude. "It means more than you know." He hadn't realized how much he had needed this moment of validation until now. He had spent so long feeling like an outsider in a world that constantly judged him based on his appearance, his background, and even his race. But now, it was as if someone had finally seen him for who he truly was, and it was the most powerful thing he could have ever experienced. The owner nodded, a genuine look of understanding in their eyes. "No one should ever feel invisible, especially not here," they said, their voice firm. "I'll make sure that doesn't happen again. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to reach out." This airline is about more than just flying planes. It's about respect, equality, and making sure everyone feels valued. The pilot felt a new sense of purpose stirring within him. It wasn't just about flying planes anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about standing up for what was right, for ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, was treated with the respect they deserved. He had always believed in the power of hard work, in pushing through adversity, but now he realized that there was something even more powerful, the power of being seen for who you truly were. As the owner turned to leave, the pilot couldn't help but feel a sense of empowerment. He had been given a glimpse of what it meant to truly be respected, and it was something he would never forget. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about the promise of change, of a world where people like him could stand tall without feeling like they had to prove their worth over and over again. For the rest of the flight, the pilot sat quietly, reflecting on the conversation. The clouds below seemed to stretch on forever, and the sky was endless, just like the possibilities that lay ahead. He had been given an opportunity to make a difference, and he was determined to make the most of it. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with the support of the owner and the acknowledgement of his worth, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in his path. As the plane continued its journey, the pilot leaned back in his seat, reflecting on the conversation with the airline owner. The words they had exchanged replayed in his mind over and over again. It wasn't just the apology that resonated with him. It was the recognition of his efforts, the acknowledgement of his hard work. For the first time, he felt like someone truly saw him for who he was. It wasn't about the uniform, the title, or the position he held. It was about the person he had become after years of dedication and perseverance. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, to the memories of dreaming about flying. He had always known that aviation was his calling. Growing up, he often found himself staring at the sky, watching planes soar overhead, imagining what it would be like to be up there. His parents had always encouraged him, even when others doubted him. They had always told him that nothing was impossible if he worked hard enough. And so he did. He spent countless hours studying, training, and pushing himself to his limits to become a pilot. But as he made his way through the industry, he began to notice something that he couldn't ignore. People saw him differently because of the color of his skin. In a world where opportunities seemed to come easily to others, he had to fight for every inch. It was something he had grown used to, something he had learned to live with. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. It didn't mean that the sting of being overlooked, underestimated, or judged based on nothing more than his appearance didn't cut deep. As he sat in his seat, the pilot thought about the path that had brought him here. His journey hadn't been easy. There had been many times when he questioned whether it was all worth it. But now, after the conversation with the owner, he realized just how far he had come. The struggles, the challenges, the obstacles, they had all been part of the process. And now, they had led him to a place where he could truly make a difference. The owner's words had ignited something inside him, a sense of purpose that had been dormant for far too long. It wasn't just about the respect he had earned as a pilot. It was about the chance to use his position to help others, to be the person who made a difference, who stood up for what was right, who fought for fairness and equality. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his efforts could have a lasting impact. He could help change the way the industry saw people like him. He could be the example that others looked up to. But as much as the pilot wanted to believe in the change he could help create, there was a part of him that still felt uncertain. He had been let down before by promises of progress and fairness. People often said the right things, but when it came time to make real change, those promises fell flat. He didn't want to get his hopes up too high, only to be disappointed again. But there was something about the way the owner had spoken, the sincerity in their voice, that made him want to believe. The conversation with the owner had opened his eyes to something he hadn't realized before, the power of recognition. It wasn't enough to simply work hard. It was about being seen and acknowledged for that hard work. He thought about how many others, like him, had worked just as hard, but had never received the recognition they deserved. How many people had been overlooked because of their background, their race, or their status. It was a harsh reality, but it was one that he couldn't ignore. And now he felt a responsibility to do something about it. As the flight continued, the pilot found himself thinking about the future. What could he do with the opportunity that had been presented to him? How could he take the owner's words and turn them into action? He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But he was ready for it. He was ready to take on the challenges that lay ahead, to fight for what was right, and to make sure that no one else would ever have to feel the way he had felt that day. He would use his position to create change, to inspire others, and to help make the world a more inclusive place for everyone. The plane began its descent, and the pilot could see the lights of the city below, twinkling like stars against the dark sky. It was a beautiful sight, one that always made him feel like anything was possible. As the wheels touched down, he felt a sense of determination rise within him. This was just the beginning. The journey he had started so many years ago had brought him to this point, and now he was ready to take the next step. When the plane finally came to a stop, the pilot stood up, ready to disembark. The weight of the conversation with the owner still lingered, but now it felt like a weight that he could carry with pride. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a symbol of what could be accomplished when hard work, determination, and opportunity came together. He was determined to show the world that no one should ever be overlooked, no matter who they were or where they came from. And in that moment, he knew that he had the power to make that change happen. The days that followed the flight were a whirlwind for the pilot. He found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The conversation with the airline owner, the acknowledgement of his hard work, and the promise of change. It was hard to shake the feeling that his life had shifted in a way he hadn't expected. The events of that one flight had ignited something inside him, a spark that refused to be extinguished. It was as if the weight of years spent proving himself had been lifted. and now he was free to focus on something greater than just flying planes. He had an opportunity to make a real difference. But with that opportunity came uncertainty. It wasn't just about fighting for change in the airline or the aviation industry. It was about changing people's perceptions, changing how the world saw him and how the world saw others who looked like him. He had spent so many years learning to ignore the stares, the assumptions, and the doubts others had cast his way. But now, for the first time, he was starting to question everything. Was it really possible to change how people viewed him? Could he truly make a difference, or would he be just another person who tried and failed? The pilot spent the following days talking to colleagues, to friends, and to people he respected in the industry. He wanted to understand if the feelings of alienation he had experienced were shared by others. To his surprise, many of his colleagues, especially those who had worked in aviation for years, admitted to feeling the same way. They too had faced judgment and bias, whether it was because of their race, their gender, or their background. It wasn't just something that had happened to him. It was something that many people had dealt with in silence, pushing through it because they had no other choice. This realization hit him hard. He had always believed that his struggles were unique, that he was the only one who had to face this particular set of challenges. But hearing others speak about their own experiences made him realize that the problem was far bigger than just one person's story. The pilot felt a sense of solidarity with his colleagues, but he also felt a deep sense of frustration. If so many people were struggling, why hadn't things changed? Why was the system still so broken? He thought about the conversation he had with the airline owner again. The words of support and promise had been comforting, but they also felt like a heavy responsibility. The owner had recognized his value, but what about everyone else? What about those who didn't have the same platform, the same voice, to speak up? How could he use his newfound understanding to help others? Was it even possible for someone in his position to make a significant impact, or would his efforts be lost in a sea of indifference? As these thoughts swirled in his mind, the pilot couldn't help but wonder about his place in the world. He had always believed in hard work, in pushing through adversity, but now he realized that it wasn't enough. Hard work wasn't the only thing that mattered. What really mattered was being seen for who you were, being recognized for your efforts, and being given the opportunity to succeed based on your abilities, not the color of your skin or your background. He remembered the moments when he had first started in the aviation industry, the way people had doubted him, the way he had been treated as if he didn't belong. It had been hard to rise above those doubts, but he had done it. He had proven himself, again and again. And yet, even with all that hard work, the same biases still lingered. The pilot knew that the system had to change. But how could he be a part of that change? What could he do to help others who didn't have the same platform, who didn't have the same opportunities to speak up? One afternoon, after a long conversation with a close friend who had also faced similar challenges in their career, the pilot had a breakthrough. It wasn't enough to simply be a good pilot or a hard worker. He needed to use his position to be a voice for others. He needed to speak up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of who they were. He needed to push for change, not just within his own career, but in the industry as a whole. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to be a part of that shift. He couldn't afford to stay silent any longer. The pilot began to think of ways he could make his voice heard. He started speaking out about the challenges that many in the industry faced, sharing his experiences with others who had felt the same way. He reached out to organizations that supported diversity and inclusion in aviation, looking for ways to collaborate and make real progress. He knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. He couldn't stand by and let things stay the way they were. As he worked to make a difference, the pilot felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced before. He had always been driven by his love of flying, but now he was driven by something even more powerful, the desire to make the world a better place for those who came after him. It wasn't just about himself anymore. It was about leaving a legacy, about changing the way the industry and the world saw people like him. The pilot had come a long way since that flight. He had gone from feeling invisible, overlooked, and underestimated to feeling empowered, determined, and ready to take on the world. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and he knew there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to face them. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a voice for change, and he was determined to make sure that no one else would ever have to feel like they didn't belong. The weeks after the pilot's decision to advocate for change were both exciting and challenging. He was determined to make a difference, but he quickly realized that making real change was not as simple as he had hoped. The aviation industry, like many others, was built on years of tradition and established ways of doing things. The pilot knew that disrupting those traditions wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the fight. At first, he started small. He reached out to some of his colleagues, people he trusted, people who had worked alongside him for years. He shared his experiences with them, explaining the challenges he had faced in his career and the new direction he wanted to take. To his surprise, many of them shared similar stories. They had experienced the same frustrations, the same sense of being overlooked or judged based on their race, gender, or background. The more he spoke to others, the more he realized how widespread the problem was. One by one, his colleagues opened up about their own struggles, and together, they began to build a network of support. It wasn't just about getting better seats in the break room or being given more recognition for their work. It was about creating a culture where everyone, regardless of who they were, felt valued and respected. It was about changing the way the industry viewed people and making sure that no one ever felt invisible or ignored. The pilot knew that this wasn't going to be a quick process, but he was encouraged by the response. His colleagues were eager to join him in his efforts, to be part of something bigger than just the job they had been doing for years. They wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. But as the group began to grow, the pilot realized there was a much larger battle ahead. The larger part of the struggle was convincing those in power, those who had the ability to make real, lasting changes, that the system needed to be reformed. The owner of the airline had been a powerful ally, but now, the pilot needed to go beyond just the top leadership. He needed to reach out to other influential figures within the industry. He needed to get their attention and show them that the changes they were fighting for were not just a matter of individual desire. They were essential to the success and future of the industry itself. It was at this point that the pilot realized how deeply ingrained these issues were. As he spoke with more people in leadership roles, he often encountered skepticism. There were those who felt that the status quo was working fine, that there was no need to change things that had been in place for decades. But there were also others who, while sympathetic, didn't understand the depth of the problem. They saw diversity and inclusion as buzzwords, something to be discussed in meetings but not really acted upon. This realization was a turning point for the pilot. He understood that to make a difference, he couldn't just talk about the problem. He had to show the industry what was at stake. He needed to illustrate that the industry wasn't just losing out on potential talent, but that it was also damaging its own reputation by failing to embrace diversity and inclusion. He knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but he was more determined than ever to succeed. The pilot began to take more active steps to raise awareness. He worked with advocacy groups focused on diversity in aviation, attending conferences, and meeting with others who shared his goals. He spoke publicly about his experiences, using his platform to reach as many people as possible. He talked about the importance of creating an inclusive environment, one where everyone, regardless of background, could thrive and contribute. He also made sure that his efforts didn't stop at words. He wanted to show people that real change could happen, and that it didn't have to be a distant dream. He started collaborating with organizations that work to help underrepresented groups gain access to the aviation industry, offering mentorship programs and scholarships to aspiring pilots from diverse backgrounds. It was a small start, but he knew it was a crucial step toward building a more inclusive future for aviation. As he worked with more people and saw the positive impact of his efforts, the pilot began to feel a renewed sense of hope. He saw the change that was possible, and it gave him the energy to keep going. He was no longer just a pilot flying planes. He was a part of something bigger. He was helping to shape the future of the industry, and he knew that the work he was doing would have a lasting impact on those who came after him. But even with the progress he had made, the pilot knew the battle was far from over. He had seen how hard it was to change deeply rooted systems, and he knew there would be resistance along the way. But as long as there were people who were willing to fight for what was right, he felt that change was possible. And with every conversation, every step forward, he was reminded of the importance of the work he was doing. The pilot understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about his personal experiences. It was about creating a legacy of fairness, equality, and opportunity for future generations. He wanted to make sure that no one else would have to fight the same battles he had fought, that no one else would ever feel as invisible as he once had. With that in mind, he remained focused on the task at hand. The road ahead was long, and the work was far from finished, but he was more determined than ever. He had started something important, and he wasn't going to stop until the industry was a place where everyone felt seen, valued, and respected. The pilot sat in his office, staring out the window at the sprawling city below. The view was as breathtaking as always, but today it felt different. For the first time in years, he felt that everything he had worked for, everything he had endured, was coming together. The changes he had fought for, the conversations he had started, and the movement he had helped build were all beginning to take shape. But the journey wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. His work had sparked something powerful. What had started as small conversations with his colleagues and the airline's management had grown into a full-scale initiative. Diversity and inclusion in the aviation industry were no longer just topics discussed in quiet corners. They were now part of the mainstream conversation, and he had played a pivotal role in that transformation. As he looked out the window, he thought about how far he had come. He remembered the early days of his career, when he had felt invisible, when every step forward had been met with resistance and doubt. Back then, the idea of speaking up for change had seemed almost impossible. But now, everything felt different. The challenges hadn't disappeared, but he had learned to face them with strength and determination. He had learned that change was possible, even in the most difficult situations. The pilot had spent months, even years, working to make the industry more inclusive. He had worked with countless organizations, spoken at numerous events, and met with powerful people who had the ability to make real change. Slowly, the barriers began to fall. More women and people of color were entering the aviation field, breaking through the glass ceilings that had held them back for so long. The pilot was proud of the progress, but he knew there was still work to do. The journey toward true equality wasn't something that could be completed in a few months or even a few years. It was a lifelong mission. One of the most rewarding moments for the pilot came when he was invited to speak at an international aviation conference. It was an event that brought together leaders from across the globe, people who could make decisions that would affect the entire industry. The pilot was nervous at first. He wasn't used to speaking in front of such an influential crowd. But he quickly realized that this was his moment. This was his opportunity to show everyone what was possible when they worked together for change. He stood in front of the crowd, the microphone in his hand, and spoke from the heart. He shared his personal story, the struggles he had faced, the doubts he had overcome, and the work he had done to help create a more inclusive environment in aviation. He talked about the importance of seeing people for who they truly were, beyond the labels that society placed on them. He spoke about how diversity wasn't just about race or gender. It was about creating a workplace where everyone, no matter their background, could bring their unique perspectives and talents to the table. The room was silent as he spoke, and when he finished, there was a moment of stillness before the crowd erupted into applause. It was a powerful moment for the pilot, not just because of the recognition he received, but because he knew that his message had been heard. The change was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. In the months that followed, the pilot continued to work with others in the industry, pushing for reforms and supporting initiatives that would make aviation more accessible to everyone. He worked to create mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, making sure that the next generation of pilots would have the support they needed to succeed. And he wasn't alone in this fight. The network of colleagues, allies, and organizations he had built over the years had grown stronger. And together, they were creating an industry that was more inclusive and more representative of the world outside. But even with all the progress, the pilot knew that change was never truly finished. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. And that was okay, because he had learned that change wasn't a destination. It was a journey. It was about making progress, no matter how small, and continuing to push forward. It was about never giving up, even when things seemed difficult or impossible. As the pilot reflected on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. But more than that, he felt a sense of responsibility. He had started something, and now it was his duty to make sure that the work continued. He knew that the future of aviation depended on creating a space where everyone could thrive, where people of all backgrounds could come together and contribute their unique skills and perspectives. And as he thought about all the people he had helped and the changes he had inspired, the pilot realized that he had achieved more than just professional success. He had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo and worked together to make the world a better place. The city below was still sprawling, the lights twinkling like stars. The pilot stood up from his desk, a sense of purpose in his step. He had no idea what the future held, but he was ready for whatever came next, because he knew one thing for sure. The fight for equality and inclusivity was far from over, and he would continue to be a part of that fight, pushing forward and leading by example. For the first time in his career, he felt truly seen, by his colleagues, by the industry, and by himself. And that feeling of recognition was the greatest reward of all.